Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second virtual lesson for AP Environmental Science. My name is Dr. Scott Sowell, and I teach APES at Darnell Cookman Middle High School in Jacksonville, Florida. So just as a little warm-up to kind of get our brains back into gear here, I want to take a look at a question or a topic from Miss Fassler's previous lesson, the first virtual lesson, on point versus non-point. So take a look at this multiple choice question, and I'll give you 30 seconds to answer it. All right, so the answer was D. So we're looking for both a point and a non-point. Unfortunately, A, both of them were point sources, and B and C were both non-point sources. So just to kind of get your brain thinking again about point versus non-point that Ms. Fassler talked about yesterday. So where are we going today? We are going to be looking at 8.4, human impacts on wetlands, and 8.5 on eutrophication. I know the title of this slide really focused on 8.2, human impacts. We are going to do that, but we're just going to go into a little bit more detail specifically on wetlands and also on eutrophication. And through both of those topics, we're going to look at two skills. Practice number 7, environmental solutions, so describing potential solutions to environmental problems, as well as the role visual representations play, not only in your understanding of environmental science concepts, but perhaps even communicating those ideas to others. Top little right thing here that says AP exam is a good reminder for me to clarify something. So you may have heard from the College Board or your teacher or from each other that the APES exam this year, the AP exam, will only cover the first 7 units. So you may ask, well, why are we looking at units 8 and 9? There are very important topics within 8 and 9 that are still very useful and critical for you to know, especially in terms of what the college expects for you to know if you're getting credit for this course. So while the first 7 are what you're being tested on, 8 and 9 will not be. However, there's plenty of things that we're going to loop back to in the first 7 units through our work with units 8 and 9. And once we get through 8 and 9, then we'll start reviewing 1 through 7 as well. All right, so by the end of this lesson, we're going to see how well you can do these 4 things. So right now, as I go through them, just think, how comfortable are you with this? So the first one, could you explain the impacts of specific human activities on aquatic ecosystems like a wetland or a river? Could you identify and describe what kinds of scientific data to collect to support your explanation? Could you propose a solution to whatever issue you identify? And then could you effectively use visual representations of science content during that process? So we'll see how comfortable you feel with these 4 things at the end of this lesson today. So you'll notice that in these questions, I've bulleted the task verbs. So these are ones that you're going to see on the FRQs. So calculate, describe, explain, identify, justify, make a claim, and propose a solution. These words are not used lightly. They have real meaning. And so your answer and the type of answer and the length of your answer and the structure of your answer will change based on these task verbs. So I would recommend really getting to know them. The one we're going to focus on a lot today is propose a solution, that very bottom one, because that's a specific science practice. All right, so let's get started. So this is 8.4, human impacts on wetlands and mangroves. And through this, we are again going to look at the practice number 7, and specifically 7B, describe potential responses or approaches. So in order to get through this first section on wetlands and mangroves, you should be able to explain the impacts of human activity on those 2 wetlands. To get there, we're going to describe what a wetland is. If we're going to talk about wetlands, we need to define wetlands, including mangrove forests. We're going to identify some human actions that affect those ecosystems. Then we'll look at the effects, both economic and environmental, of those actions. And then finally, we'll look at some solutions. So just looping back to prior units, there is some content that we're going to talk about today that you might want to review. And then by doing this lesson, it'll help you review those as well. So for example, Unit 1, Topic 3, Aquatic Biomes, nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. We all love the biogeochemical cycles, and they are definitely not something we learn and don't use the rest of the course. Those cycles continually loop back over and over again, and today's no exception. We'll be looking at both of those. So let's just define wetlands. A wetland is any part or any area where water covers the soil, either part or all of the time. And these can look very different depending on where they are. They might be coastal, they might be inland, therefore they might have different salinity levels, freshwater, saltwater, brackish. So they can look differently, but they're all going to have that characteristic of the soil being covered by water, either part or all of the time. Two big categories of wetlands. There are different categories. There's other classifications, but the two that I think are worthy of looking at today are marshes, which are dominated by grasses, and swamps, which are dominated by trees. Both wetlands, but two different types of dominant vegetation. And in particular, one type of swamp is a mangrove forest. This is a type of coastal wetland. It's got these very unique mangrove trees that are salt tolerant, salt loving, and they've got these very characteristic finger-like crop roots that grab onto the soil. So clearly would be a great thing to reduce soil erosion. Rich biodiversity, lots of habitats for different species. Species richness and productivity would be high here. There's a large one in South Florida, here where I am. The largest one is in Asia, but we do have some here in the United States. All right, so why do we care? Why do we care about these wetlands? So we have some ecological services that are really, really important. First of all, water filtration and purification. So I want you to kind of imagine over here on the left-hand side, there's a flowing river that is going to eventually empty into this large body of water like an ocean over here. But in between this fast flowing water and this other body of water, we've got this marsh right here. And this marsh almost acts like a speed bump, and it slows that water down. And as the water slows down, some of the sediments can settle out, so the water is a little bit cleaner. The second way it does this is look at all this vegetation. All of these grasses are assimilating and absorbing nitrogen and phosphorus. So by the water simply passing through this wetland on its way out, it is reducing turbidity, sediments are coming out, but it's also reducing the nutrient load, the amount of nitrates and phosphates in the water. There's some similarities here between what actually happens in a wastewater treatment plant. So next unit, when we talk about wastewater treatment plants, things that humans have built to clean our wastewater, think about some parallels with what the natural world already does with wetlands. So something kind of cool to think about for next unit. So clearly, here's our nitrogen cycle. We've got the good old nitrogen cycle, and specifically, we're talking about assimilation. Plants assimilating or taking up nitrates, phosphates, sulfates, all the eights. That's how I tell my students to remember it. But this is a great example of a visual representation. We've got all these little pieces and parts that we need to figure out. You know, what does rhizobium play? What is ammonification? What is denitrifying bacteria? All the little players and components, and then it tells a story. There's some utility to this model, to this visual representation. And you're gonna see visual representations more than likely on the exam. So let's take a look at another benefit. So flood protection. So not only does this wetland act like a speed bump to slow the water down, it also acts like a giant sponge, especially for storm surges and events like hurricanes. So the picture on the left, there's a big storm surge, big wave crashing right into the land, pretty destructive. But imagine if that wave had to travel through this wetland before it reached shore. So it has a really good function for us to protect us from storm surge and flooding. And then clearly, it's got a large habitat, or a wide variety of habitats, lots of species richness for both terrestrial and aquatic species. A little alligator sitting in a swamp. So that's what wetlands are. Pretty simple to understand. Their benefits are many. And then we come along. So we definitely need to understand the anthropogenic or human-caused threats to wetlands. So the first one we'll talk about is commercial development. If I build where a wetland was, the wetland is no more. Pretty straightforward. So commercial development in buildings and roads and shopping malls and parking lots, all of that stuff could impact wetlands. We mentioned before that there's a great biodiversity in wetlands. And so overfishing might disrupt dramatically those food webs. And if we see species richness start to fall away and we have much more of an unstable food web, the overall sustainability or the equilibrium or the resistance and resilience of that ecosystem could go down. And of course, like the picture says here, a dam. A dam is clearly going to disrupt the natural flow of the water and therefore probably alter the locations of wetlands. It might destroy wetlands in some places, or even maybe above the dam in the reservoir, it creates additional wetlands. But it's definitely a threat to the natural distribution of wetlands. And finally, this is the one that we're going to talk mainly about today, is pollutants from agriculture and industrial waste. If you'll remember from yesterday, Ms. Fassler talked about non-point source pollution. So that agricultural runoff, those inorganic fertilizers becoming soluble in rainwater. And as that groundwater moves and the surface water moves, it's going to drag those inorganic nutrients to a different location. And that surface water can run off and eventually make it into bodies of water. So if we understand what wetlands are, we see some of the threats. Now let's think about solutions. So I really like the way that this practice is laid out. The overall practice says propose and justify solutions. But you can notice that it goes in levels of complexity. The first part, 7A, what's the problem? You've got to understand the problem before you can do anything about it. And then 7B says, okay, I've got this problem. Let's think of some possible ideas, right? And then 7C and 7D say, of those possible solutions, what kind of advantages, disadvantages, unintended consequences, pros and cons, how do those things help you make your decision, as well as what empirical scientific data could you collect to help you make that decision? And then towards 7E and 7F is you finally make that decision and then justify it. So it's a really beautiful way of describing environmental solutions, which oftentimes we just think of as, there's a problem, oh, here's an idea. Well, that's very different. We're not just coming up with an idea, we're trying to formulate the best solution possible. Here's a common mistake though, when talking about environmental solutions. A common mistake is to provide a solution that is simply unrealistic. So on an FRQ, if you're asked to talk about solutions, make sure it's realistic, something that could actually happen. Here's an example, and this example, I apologize, isn't about wetlands. It just happens to come from last year's exam. So it says one reason that people visit national parks is to view the scenery. Visibility at the four parks in the graph has been reduced over time so that by 2015, the visibility was an average of 70 miles less than the historical visibility. Regional air pollution sources are commonly located over 100 miles away from national parks. So we've got this situation where the visibility in the park has gone dramatically down. And the first part of the question asks you to identify certain pollutants that might be involved in this, whether they're primary or secondary. But then the subsequent question says, discuss 2 specific actions that the state or federal government could take or encourage to further improve the visibility in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So if you look at the scoring guidelines for this question, it says this is worth 2 points because it's asking for 2 specific actions, 1 point each for each correct and realistic discussion. So your discussions, your solutions have to be realistic. So for example, you could require or offer incentives for companies to reduce their emissions, limit the vehicle traffic in the park. The last one, limit incineration practices or prohibit campfires. All of those are realistic. In the chief reader report, where the readers from the grading of the FRQs kind of talk about common misconceptions, they say about this part that strategies such as move factories to further than 100 miles from the park or close down all the factories in the area did not earn points because they were not realistic. So just keep that in mind as you look at solutions for FRQs. All right, let's just do a quick check for understanding. I'm going to give you another multiple choice question. So it says, a beach community was recently negatively affected by a hurricane. Community leaders are looking for a potential solution to prevent damage from future hurricanes. Below is a list of their concerns, as well as how important each issue is to the community. So take 30 seconds, look through those community concerns, and answer this question. Which of the following solutions would best address the issues of greatest concern in the community? All right, so hopefully you picked planting the mangrove forest. When I first read this question, the thing that stood out to me was the importance of roosting bird species, and clearly mangrove forest would provide that. So here's another example. This is the 2003 FRQ question number 3. I'm not going to ask you to answer this one, but I just want to point out that based on what we just learned, you would probably score very well on this FRQ. I've underlined the task verbs for you. I want to pay close attention to this one. Discuss 2 roles that coastal wetlands play that are ecologically important, and 2 roles that they play that are economically important. And then it says, hey, what have we done? Describe or identify and explain 3 ways in which humans have had a negative impact. And then finally, what's some kind of proposal or solution? So there's the same model that we just did. We identify why ecosystems or wetlands were important, what have we done to them, and what might we do to improve that or provide a solution. Quick reminder, if an FRQ asks you to identify 2 things, then the first 2 things are the only things that'll be scored. For example, if I said right now, name 2 fruits, and you say elephant, chicken, apple, and banana, you'd score 0 points because the first 2 things you said were incorrect. So be sure that you are very clear in what the directions say and what you should write. And remember, it's not about what you meant, it's about what you wrote. So to strengthen your understanding a little bit about wetlands, I want to show you a clip from Dr. Silliman, and he is working in a coastal salt marsh. The video is a couple of minutes long, maybe 10 minutes long. We're not going to watch all of it, just the first minute or so that you can get some visuals of a wetland. He's also going to talk about some of their benefits.
When I walk into the marsh, one of the first things that I notice is this vast intertidal grassland of hugely productive vegetation.
Salt marshes are found in protected coastal waters and temperate zones all over the world.
Salt marshes are world famous for being among the most productive ecosystems in the world. Their productivity rivals that of a plant material in tropical rainforest and animals on coral reefs. Marshes are very important for humans. They're pollution filters. They also protect our shorelines from erosion. They're really important for fisheries production. And because of those important services, people are not only interested in keeping the marshes around that are here, conserving them, but putting more out there.
I've been studying salt marshes for over 20 years to understand how they work. I want to know what forces keep them healthy and what we can do to maintain them.
So I would recommend watching the rest of that clip. It's a great clip. It's a fantastic review of food webs and trophic cascades. And it's also an excellent example of good experimental design. Mr. Silliman is very explicit about how he sets up his experiment, his experimental groups, his control groups. So again, a great video, not just to check your understanding of wetlands, but also food webs, trophic cascades, and experimental design. If you have not used them before, I wanted to introduce you to Data Nuggets. They're a brilliant resource. I use them a lot with my students. If you haven't used them before, here's a quick summary. It's a brief description of a scientific study, and it gives you some data. And then you have to answer a question based on that data. You typically generate a graph and you fill out a claim, evidence, reasoning, if you're familiar with CER. If not, it's just a way to answer a testable question using the scientific data provided to you. Well, there's lots of data nuggets out there, but there's one in particular called Marsh Makeover, in which Dr. Bowen looks at a marsh ecosystem that's undergoing restoration. So it's experiencing a solution. Someone decided this is what we're going to do to improve the wetland, and they're doing it. So her job is to go in and say, well, how well is this working? So she sets up an experiment in which she studies the response to the native grasses from that restoration. So it's a cool review, highly recommend it. And it also touches a lot on the carbon cycle, because it talks about carbon storage capacity of the marsh. All right, that's 8.4. Let's move more into 8.5 now, a little bit more focused on a particular phenomenon called eutrophication. And as we go through this, I'm going to try to focus a lot on visual representations. Our course really relies on diagrams and images and models, things to help us understand these Earth systems and how we affect them. So for example, this is coming from the College Board. So at the bottom, it says visual representations are tools for learning and exploring scientific concepts and ideas. And it lists a lot of them. Just think about the soil triangle. We all looked at the soil triangle when we were in our soil and agriculture conversations, and that's a great visual representation, and it has a story to tell. It's not just how much silt was in my soil sample. You take that and you use the story to talk about agricultural amendments you might give to a soil, or what type of soil might work best to line the bottom of a landfill. So those visual representations individually, you need to understand them, but then you also need to be able to use them in other contexts. So by the end of this section, you should be able to explain the environmental effects of excessive use of fertilizers on aquatic ecosystems. So in order to get you to that understanding, we're first going to talk about systems where that problem is non-existent. So that's oligotrophic waterways. Oligotrophic waterways do not have this excessive fertilizer being dumped into them. So we're going to study that first. Then we'll talk about how those fertilizers get into those systems. And you should probably already start thinking about those non-point sources, agricultural runoff, inorganic fertilizers that Ms. Fassler talked about yesterday. And then once those fertilizers get in there, we now have a system that is eutrophic. So we're going to go from oligotrophic to eutrophic. And then we're going to talk about what are the effects of that on not only the environment, but the economy. And finally, we'll again look at how visual representations help us to do that. So let's do oligotrophic first. This is a pretty clear example. So a typical body that's oligotrophic is low in nutrient levels, so not a lot of nitrates, not a lot of phosphates. Low turbidity, here's a good word to remember. Remember that turbidity means cloudiness. So if I had a pure glass of water, drinking water, the turbidity would be low, but my tea here is kind of cloudy, and that has higher turbidity. So an oligotrophic body of water has low nutrients, low turbidity, and high dissolved oxygen, high DO. And because there's a stable amount of, or a high amount of dissolved oxygen, it can maintain a stable population of fish. And finally, a characteristic is that there's not a lot of algae growth. And that'll become apparent when we look at the next thing, eutrophic. And eutrophic bodies of water are the opposite. So they have high nutrient levels. Again, start thinking about how those nutrients could have gotten there. It's more cloudy, more turbidity. The DO is lower and therefore sometimes cannot sustain healthy fish populations. And finally, as you can see in the picture, lots of algae usually. So we have a lot of algae growth. Now, I need to pause here and mention that this can happen naturally. There's natural eutrophication. Bodies of water can become eutrophic over a long period of time, and that's completely natural and normal. What we're more concerned about in environmental science is cultural eutrophication, when humans do this process very quickly and intensely, so that the effects are much more dramatic. Just as a little side note, this is a great tool to measure turbidity called a Secchi disk. And so if I have really turbid water, like the water on the right-hand side, if I lower this disk down, you'll notice I start to lose it. If this water was really clear, I could lower this disc almost all the way to the bottom and still see the black and the white. So a Secchi disc is a great way to measure turbidity by simply lowering the rope down and measuring the distance down before you lose sight of the black and the white. So a great physical test for the water. So here's a good visual image. So I want you to look at the title first. So this is eutrophic and hypoxic coastal areas. Hypoxic means low oxygen. So take 15 seconds, stare at this visual image and maybe start to think, what story is it trying to tell you? When I look at this, I see, obviously it's on the coast. This is coastal eutrophication, but it's also more apparent in places with high human populations. You know, I don't see a lot in Greenland. So let's zoom in a little bit on just the United States. Huge amount of eutrophication and hypoxic conditions along the eastern coast, particularly Florida. You can barely see my state from all the dots. Well, we're going to look at one particular place where eutrophication has occurred in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's occurred so predominantly and consistently and profoundly that it's become quite famous as a dead zone. So I'm going to show you a clip from a Miami news channel, and they're going to do a great job at talking not just about the mechanics of what's happening in eutrophication, but also what are the economic and environmental consequences. So as we watch this, try to note what causes eutrophication and what are the effects.
A man-made phenomenon is threatening marine life in the Gulf of Mexico. The largest dead zone ever recorded in the U.S. has appeared at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Scientists say it's primarily caused by fertilizer and sewage that wash off farmland. The runoff eventually makes its way to the sea, where it feeds algae blooms and bacteria that sucks out all the oxygen of the water. CBS News correspondent Jeff Glor is in Louisiana with how the dead zone is impacting one of the largest seafood industries in the country.
Underwater video we recorded yesterday afternoon shows the transition from life to death as green fades to black. It becomes so dark, divers need flashlights to find their way around. Down here, there is almost no oxygen in the water, and this void stretches over an enormous portion of the Gulf.
This is the largest one we've ever measured and the second largest human-caused dead zone in the ocean.
Nancy Rabelais is the nation's foremost expert on dead zones. She's been measuring oxygen levels in the Gulf since 1985.
It's a feature that's large, it's not getting smaller, and attempts to manage the nutrients, nitrogen, particularly from the Mississippi River, are not having an effect on reducing the size.
Dead zones happen when agricultural runoff sends nitrogen-rich fertilizer downstream into the sea. The fertilizer feeds harmful amounts of algae at the surface that eventually die and sink to the bottom. Bacteria feast on the dead algae, removing oxygen from the water, and fish, crabs, and shrimp are forced to leave or suffocate and die.
The solution lies upstream in the watershed with better agricultural management practices, a switch to crops that have deeper roots and don't need as much fertilizer and are still just as profitable as corn.
The water we watched them measure yesterday has less than half the oxygen needed to support basic fish life.
It's almost like a different planet.
It's very, yeah. If you're a scuba diver, you're used to having fish swimming all around you. From 30 to 60 feet, we won't see any fish.
Nothing.
Nothing.
These species of shrimp are not there like they used to be.
O'Neill John Sabin has been fishing these waters more than 40 years.
From a fishing perspective, you're talking about smaller shrimp or no shrimp at all.
Correct.
A study led by Duke University published this year found that dead zones in the Gulf do slow shrimp growth, resulting in higher prices for larger shrimp.
Do you see this issue getting better anytime soon?
Boy, I wish it would. I really do wish it would.
The EPA has set up a task force to look at dead zones. They are hoping to reduce nutrient-rich runoff by 20% by 2025. In Dulac, Louisiana, Jeff Glor, CBS News.
So hopefully you heard in there some terms that you were familiar with: agricultural runoff, dissolved oxygen, nitrates. So let's continue on. So again, this Gulf of Mexico dead zone is really a result of this Mississippi watershed right above it. So remember the word watershed, that's such an important term to understanding how surface water and groundwater moves across the land. So all of the water or all of the agriculture that goes on within the Mississippi watershed, if there's any nutrient runoff, any of that non-point source runoff of inorganic fertilizers will eventually make its way down into the Gulf of Mexico when we get that dead zone. So the next thing I'm going to show you is a kind of a visual representation of eutrophication that I put together for myself to better understand it, and I've used it with my students. So now that you've heard the description in the video and the news clip, now take a look at my version and see how well they jive together. So we're going to start with wastewater release. So if we think about CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, or point source pollution coming from maybe a wastewater treatment plant, but we're looking at wastewater entering the water. Well, as soon as something like that hits the water, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to start being decomposed. So before this wastewater release happened, there was a few decomposers. Decomposers are naturally there. Decomposers are everywhere. But all of a sudden, this wastewater comes in, and now there's just so much food available for these decomposers that their population skyrockets. Just a huge explosion in the population of these decomposers. Well, decomposers need oxygen. So before the wastewater, there was only a little bit of a demand for oxygen, and the amount of oxygen in the water was really high. But then all of a sudden, we have this huge explosion of decomposers that's demanding all of that oxygen, and the dissolved oxygen starts to go down. One of the byproducts of these decomposers is nitrogen and phosphorus. Well, as we know from our biogeochemical cycles, that is easily assimilated into plants. And so now we get this notion of eutrophication. The pollution is fertilizer, is nutrients. So this huge influx of nutrients fertilizes the algae. It's food for the algae. And now we get a huge explosion of algae population, and we call that an algae bloom. So just imagine if I have a cornfield and I want to make that corn grow really, really strong, I'm going to add fertilizer. And simply what's happening here in the water, fertilizer for the algae. So now we have this huge explosion of algae. So the water is going to get more turbid. It may even block sunlight from lower submerged vegetation. But here's the next problem in the sequence. We also have agricultural runoff adding even more nitrates and phosphates into the water. However, algae don't live long. So eventually they're going to die. So this massive explosion is all going to die and become even more food for decomposers who are going to suck more oxygen out of the water. And now we have this hypoxic condition and a dead zone where we might have a fish kill. Sometimes the fish can swim away, maybe, but if you're an organism that's fixed in place, maybe you can't leave. Remember from yesterday's discussion with Ms. Fassler, range of tolerance. So each organism has a range of tolerance for lots of different abiotic conditions. And dissolved oxygen is one of those. So there's a range in which the amount of dissolved oxygen is okay for me to live. But if it gets any lower, I start to not perform as well as I might. If it gets too low, I can't live there. So range of tolerance is a good thing to bring back from yesterday and today, or from the last lesson into today. So you've heard it once from the news, you've heard it once from my diagram. Here's the last iteration of it, a little 1-minute quick summary.
What is eutrophication? It's a problem that should matter to you, whether you live near the ocean or not. That's because it begins wherever people live and ends with damage to resources we all use and enjoy. It all starts when nutrients get into lakes and oceans. Remember, what's waste to humans can be food to plants and other creatures. Nutrients feed algae like they do other plants. Algae grows and blocks sunlight. Plants die without sunlight. Eventually, the algae dies too. Bacteria digest the dead plants, using up remaining oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide. If they can't swim away, fish and other wildlife become unhealthy or die without oxygen. But it doesn't have to be this way. protecting marine resources starts with sound agricultural and waste management practices.
So the video ends with pointing to the two things that we just talked about, agricultural runoff as well as wastewater management or wastewater release. But I do want to just put the ball in your court a little bit, or maybe in a little bit more local context. Think about someone who might have a large front yard and they're using fertilizer on that yard. Some of that fertilizer becomes soluble with rainwater, runs off into a retention pond, and now we have an algae bloom. Or imagine a big golf course nearby where they have to maintain that lush kind of monoculture crop of grass. That's going to require fertilizer. So while we can think of agriculture and wastewater, we also need to think of personal, residential, commercial causes of this as well. All right, so now let's link some stuff together. So I want you to remember, again, to Ms. Fassler the other day talking about point versus non-point. Now I want you to consider two different bodies of water. So you've got this small retention pond down here. So this is a non-flowing body of water. And then you've got this fast flowing stream. What I'd like for you to do is take 37.5 seconds and think, how might wastewater pollution from a point source affect these two waterways differently? So just take a second and think. So you may be starting to think about, well, there must be something about flowing versus non-flowing. I kind of made that pretty explicit. So let's take a look. So we're going to use a visual representation to do this. And just like the last practice, this practice goes from simple to complex. When we look at a visual representation of the soil triangle, a graph, a food web, any kind of model, the first thing we have to do is pick out the players. What are the characteristics of that visual representation? Then, second step, how are they related? Are there two variables that are related? Are there two organisms that are related? Is there a cause and effect? And then we can tell the story of what that visual is trying to tell us. One of the mistakes we often make, and I'm guilty of this too, is as soon as I see an image, I jump right down to that third thing and try to figure out what it's trying to tell me. When I should slow down just a little bit and focus on who are the players, how are the players related, and then what story is it trying to tell. So take that set of skills to this diagram. On a piece of paper, I'd love for you to just jot down what you see and what it might mean. So on a piece of paper, I'll give you 1 minute to jot some ideas down. Okay, I lied. I said a minute. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. So this is the oxygen sag curve, oxygen sag curve. This is also a learning objective within AP Environmental Science. And it really just talks about some of the things that we've mentioned before, but now in more of a flowing stream or river. So the first part of this skill is to identify the players. So because this looks like a graph, you should have noticed we've got two lines that are changing. We've got the demand for oxygen and the actual supply of oxygen. So when the demand of oxygen was low, plenty of oxygen in the water. But all of a sudden we have this point source pollution, this wastewater, huge bloom or explosion of decomposers that are demanding a ton of oxygen and sucking it out of the system. Now, you'll notice though that it starts to recover. Now, obviously, the degree of recovery would depend on how long this goes on and how intensely, but you'll notice that the dissolved oxygen and the demand for the oxygen kind of go back toward normal later on. Oxygen sag curve, great visual to understand. So could we use this visual to help us understand other contexts? So hint, 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 we'll come back to this a little later on for our FRQ practice. So here's an example of a visual image that was on the 2018 exam. So a food web, a great example of a visual representation. And the first thing that you are asked to do on that FRQ is to identify the players, pieces and the parts, what's going on there. So who's the primary producer, who's a consumer, who's a secondary consumer? And then, not surprisingly, the next question says, how are they related? What do these arrows mean? So again, that really helps you to understand the story it's trying to tell if you understand the characters involved and how they're related. So let's summarize. We had two goals, 8.4 and 8.5, and we wanted to focus on solutions and visual representations. Hopefully we've done that. Now remember those four things I asked you to think about. Let's revisit those and see if you feel maybe a little bit more comfortable doing some of them. Could you explain the impacts of specific human activities on aquatic ecosystems, such as a wetland or a river? Could you identify and describe what kinds of scientific data to collect to support your explanation? Maybe something like turbidity or dissolved oxygen or nitrates, or maybe even species richness? Could you propose a solution to local stakeholders? And then could you use visual representations within those conversations or decision-making processes? I do want to pause for a second and talk about a very common misconception. I know my students stumble with this every once in a while, and that's the role of pesticides. Pesticides are not directly involved in eutrophication. They have their own environmental problems, but remember, eutrophication is about nutrient pollution. So it's going to be much more tied to fertilizer or wastewater, something that's going to input nutrients into the system. Pesticides are not going to do that. So I want to point out a practice AP FRQ. We're not going to do this one, but I just want to point out one part of this. This is from the 2015 exam about the Everglades. It's a great question. Not that I'm biased for the Everglades from Florida, but it's a great question. But I want us to zoom in on part B here. Part B says, in addition to water quantity problems, the Everglades is faced with a variety of water quality issues. For example, phosphorus concentrations in the Everglades have increased. So I says, describe how one specific human activity contributes to increased phosphorus. We've talked about that today. Explain one way in which an increase in phosphorus adversely affects it. We've talked about that. And then I asks you to propose a solution or something we could do to fix that. So let's put this to real use. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to answer two parts of this question. So on a separate sheet of paper, again, let's answer this question. So I'll read the first part and then shut up for a few minutes and let you work. So it says, students in an environmental science class at Fremont High School tested the water quality in a stream near their school. They were concerned about the possible pollution of the stream, which flows through a farm on which hogs are raised. Shown below are a diagram that indicates the sites where the students collected water samples, labeled A through D, upstream to downstream, and a table of the results of the students' water tests. So I'm going to be quiet and give you 3 minutes to answer just A and C. All right, I lied. I said I was going to give you 3 minutes, but we're going to jump into it now. If you need more time, I apologize. So A says, did the hog farm cause it? That's what A is asking. Is the hog farm responsible for this water pollution? And so the answer is yes. And you get points for determining that, as well as using some of the data provided. And we can see that the dissolved oxygen goes from a high level and dips down and then starts to recover. That should be similar to that oxygen sag curve we just looked at. And then phosphates and nitrates follow a similar pattern. pH doesn't seem to change too much, so not really a factor. And then C says, describe a sequence of ecological changes. That should have immediately triggered you to the conversations we had about eutrophication from those models and video clips that we looked at. It's really interesting here. This is worth 3 points, and it says 0 points would be awarded simply for stating that eutrophication occurs. That would be maybe an identify, but it's not asking for an identify. It's saying describe a sequence of changes. So you would need to talk about the influx of nitrogen and phosphorus causing the algal bloom, the algae dying and being decomposed, the DO dropping, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully you feel a little confident answering this kind of an FRQ. I think it's a really nice one to draw everything together that we talked about today. I do want to say, and this is a message from the College Board, that we know that not all students have access to the internet or a device. We're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, you can reach us directly to let us know, and the URL is below. I want to say thanks. Hopefully we'll see you again as we continue to look at units 8 and 9 and then review. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye, apes.